really needs no introduction. He's one of the leading authors and speakers on the subject of the engagement between science and religion. And his day job, I believe, when he has time, is the Andreas Idrios Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford. So that's your official title. But I think you really do an awful lot of speaking and writing outside of the Oxford academic world. So it's a great privilege to have you with us, Alister. Over to you.
Good. Well, it's wonderful to be here at the Faraday Centre again, and thank you very much for having me as a speaker. It's always good for Oxford people to come across here every now and then, just to get excited by Cambridge and then go back to Oxford. My theme in this talk is biology and natural theology. I think this probably needs a little bit of explanation, which I'll give in a moment. My own background really is that of someone who began by doing a first degree in chemistry, which of course is very exciting, and I specialised in quantum theory. But then I got interested in biology, and so I switched over to doing a doctorate in molecular biophysics. And that opened up a new way of thinking in many ways. And for me, I think one of the questions that we're really looking at in this lecture is this. It's the question about the intellectual connection between the natural world and God. And the real question we're asking in this lecture is this. Is the natural world, especially, of course, the biological world, does that point towards God? Does that point away towards God? Or in fact, are we asking the wrong question? Should we be asking a different question, which is from the standpoint of Christian faith and looking at the world, does that kind of way reinforce faith, or does it raise difficulties for us? So it seems to me those are the kind of questions we're going to be exploring in this lecture. And if you think of it in terms of a pathway from nature to God, the question is, where do you begin, and what issues do you encounter along the way? And in this lecture, I can only begin to flag up some of the issues, and I'm sure that actually quite a few of these are ones you've come across in this conference already. But what I'm going to begin by doing is asking, what does this word, phrase, natural theology actually mean? And I'm going to have to begin, I'm afraid, by making this all complicated and saying actually that there is no general agreement about what this phrase, natural theology, means. But nevertheless, I'm going to talk you through 6 possible ways of looking at this, and each of them, I think, are quite interesting. So we need, I think, just to note that for a lot of people, natural theology means something like trying to prove God's existence by purely natural means. For example, by looking at the way the human mind works, or by particularly looking at the beauty of nature. I'm going to come back to that point because although I love science, I think one of the difficulties science has is it doesn't really cope all that well with the beauty of nature. Its order and its regularity, yes, but its beauty, well, that's slightly more difficult to fit into scientific theories. But what we might say is that one of the themes you find in natural theology is there some kind of intellectual resonance or synergy, or John Paul Bjorn here would say congruence, between the natural world and God, which arises out of the fact that the world is God's creation. In other words, you're arguing something like this. Look, if God made the world, and the world is to be considered as analogous to a work of art, then maybe something of God is expressed in the created order. And that, of course, raises the question, well, whereabouts do we look? How well is this defined, and so on? But we're going to come to those questions, and I'm going to begin by looking at some approaches to natural theology. Here's the first, which you're probably very familiar with. Basically, this is simply natural theology as the branch of philosophy that, without presupposing God, tries to argue its way to God. Now, this is not about looking at the beauty of nature. This is much more saying, look, by natural, we mean using natural human resources. In other words, by thinking. So we sit down, we think, and we try and ask, does that process lead us to the existence of God? So in other words, we could say it's an attempt to demonstrate the existence, or maybe figure out what God is like, without recourse to divine revelation or any ideas that aren't natural. So that's one way of thinking about natural theology. But of course, there's another way, which is probably one that you've talked about already in this conference. The phrase physico-theology, like that, physico-theology, is sometimes used. Physico, from the Greek word physis, meaning nature. This is all about not so much just thinking, but looking at nature, looking at its regularity, looking at its beauty, And saying, do these, launch us on an intellectual trajectory whose ultimate endpoint is God. It's a very significant line of thought. It's very English. If you look at people like John Ray, Isaac Newton and so on, they're all in this camp. And basically their argument is that natural theology is the obvious point of connection between the natural science and Christian theology. It gives a religious motivation for studying nature, but it also gives scientific justification to religious belief. We'll come back to that later, but it's another way of looking at this. Then there's a third approach, which you find particularly in some Catholic theologians, but actually it goes much wider than that. And that is to say that natural theology is really the intellectual outcome of something deeper. And the something deeper is some kind of instinct within human nature that there is something bigger. And Thomas Aquinas, 13th century theologian, talks about the natural desire to see God. What he means by it is it seems to be something about human nature which makes us want to go beyond the limits of reason, the limits of science. There's a bigger horizon which we need to open up and explore. And part of that is appreciating God's beauty through nature, but it's also about beginning to realize that there is a God. Now, of course, if I had time, I could say the recent developments in the cognitive science of religion actually do reinforce this point. But that, I'm afraid, would be another lecture. The fourth is, I think, very significant, and this is very, very obvious in the writings of John Polkinghorne. John and many others, I have to say, but John's a very good example, would say there's an analogy, or maybe an intellectual resonance, between the human experience of nature on the one hand, and of the Christian faith on the other. In other words, these are not the same, but nevertheless they chime in with each other. They kind of click, they connect up with each other. In other words, you can maintain their distinctiveness, but see that they naturally connect up. And so what I've tried to put on the screen here is this basic idea that natural theology is about the recognition and the exploration of this resonance between the natural world on the one hand and the Christian faith on the other. A fifth approach is to say that there's something about nature which means that we realize that purely natural accounts of reality aren't good enough. And we find this in Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. But whether you've read Alvin Plantinga or not, I think you'll recognize this approach when I describe it. And that is basically to say, look, you can have a reading of the natural world which says what you see is what you get. That's it. And that's one of the meanings of this complicated word naturalism. Natural theology is saying that's not good enough. That actually a much more intellectually satisfactory and resilient and robust reading of nature results from approaching it with a theistic perspective, or allowing you to take that reading of nature in a theistic direction. Now, this is a very, very important approach, for example, in dealing with, for example, Richard Dawkins, who in effect does offer a purely naturalist account of the world. And the challenge there is to say, look, what Dawkins sees in the world, there's no quarrel with that. The issue is, does he see and then draw a line and say there is nothing more to it than that? For example, in his book, River Out of Eden, Dawkins says that the world we observe has exactly the properties we expect. If there's no purpose, no good, no evil, no nothing, just blind, pitiless indifference. And of course, he says that's it. I would say, well, look, maybe you don't see that, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Maybe you need to look at the world through a different lens when you might begin to see it. So I think it's a very interesting approach, but the most interesting, I think, is the sixth. And this is to say that natural theology is really about what you might call a theology of nature. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is something like this. A theology of nature is the way of seeing the natural world which results when you look at it from a Christian perspective. Now, those of you who know something about the philosophy of science will be aware of this thing called theory-laden observation. What that means really is that when we look at something, we actually are not looking at it in a sort of neutral way. We already have a kind of theoretical framework which informs and interprets what we see. In other words, we're always looking at nature through a lens of some sort. William Whewell, who is one of Cambridge's best natural philosophers of the 19th century, once said that there is a mask of theory, over the face of nature, which is a nice phrase. He's just trying to say that, in fact, we don't just look at nature, we're always interpreting it certain ways. Natural theology here would be to say, look, we look at nature through a Christian lens. And that gives us a way of looking at which makes sense, and which also allows us to be increasingly attentive and perceptive towards nature. Now, it's very interesting. Let me just follow through on this a little bit before we move on to the main topic of this lecture. I've used phrases like heightened perceptiveness, something like that. But it's really about saying, look, if you're approaching nature from a Christian perspective, you're going to say, this is God's creation. And therefore, what you're going to do is say the beauty of nature is an anticipation of the greater beauty of God. And actually, you'll develop a theology which goes something like this. The more I appreciate nature, the more I appreciate God. Because the beauty of God is reflected, however inadequately, in the beauty of nature. And so by looking at the lesser beauty of nature, I get a deepened appreciation of what the greater beauty of God might be like. And going back to that analogy I gave you right at the beginning of this lecture, the work of art by an artist. I mean, one of the questions you might ask here is, look, if we're looking at a great painting, we'd look for the signature, probably in the bottom right-hand corner. Whereabouts do we see the signature of God in the natural world? And that's a very interesting question, and you will not be surprised to know that there are no obvious answers. But the point is, it makes you look and it makes you think. Richard Dawkins and I might look at the world, and in one sense we'd see pretty much the same thing. But in another sense we'd see something different. Because Dawkins is looking at a self-contained system which there's nothing beyond. I look at nature and I see it as an open system which is studded with signs and rumours and hints that there's something even better and bigger beyond it. And therefore the beauty of nature is an invitation to discover this even greater reality that lies beyond with the natural beauty of the world. So let's just say that given all these disagreements about what natural theology is, we can still see it's about what is the connection between God and the natural world. Does the natural world take us away from God, lead us towards God? And it's that kind of question I'm going to explore with you in this lecture. So let's begin to look at a very important work, which I think most of you will know, and that's William Paley's book, Natural Theology, published in 1802. This is the book which develops a very famous image, which is God as the watchmaker. And if you read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, then in effect he's really engaging with William Paley. He's taking Paley's image and saying, look, Paley thinks there's a watchmaker. In fact, natural selection is the watchmaker, and natural selection is blind. But let me tell you something about this book. It's quite late, 1802. And one of the interesting things about this book is that actually the ideas that Paley popularizes were really developed in the 1690s, perhaps up to 1750. So it's almost like a generation after these ideas were developed, Paley is presenting them in a popularized form. And he does this superbly. What Paley does is to appeal to the public interest in the Industrial Revolution. And he's saying, look, we're all around us, we see things like watches, and he gives a huge list of industrial machines like spinning jennies and lots of other machines which I had to look up in the dictionary, which are obviously very important in the early 19th century. What he's saying is, look, we designed these things and they work, they do very exciting things. And so when you look at a machine, there are two things that impress you. First of all, someone designed this for an outcome, and then secondly, somebody made it to make sure what was intended was delivered. And so Paley uses the word artifice, artifice, to mean a work which is designed and constructed. So it's both ideas, designed and constructed for a reason. And then argues that's what we see in the world around us. Nature is contrived, that is, it's designed and constructed, and basically Paley just says, look, we're all familiar with this, And nature is like that. You look at a very complex machine, it says to you somebody designed this and made this. You look at the complexities of the world, especially the biological world, and the same thought occurs to you. And Paley, of course, was deeply impressed by the human eye. Dawkins, I think, tends to regard Paley as really quite inadequate in some ways, but he is lyrical in praising Paley's description of the natural world, particularly the complexity of the human eye. And Paley's argument goes like this. This is clearly a piece of biological mechanism. It's been designed, it's been constructed, it works very, very well, and therefore that is indicative of the existence of God as designer and constructor. Now you can see that this basically is something we might want to reflect on a bit more today, that we might say that we might want to question the processes by which this actually came into being. Paley's basic assumption is that the world that we see around us is pretty much the way the world has always been. There's no development of any kind. And we'd like you to say, look, Paley's writing in 1802, the evidence for evolution was just beginning to accumulate around then, so we mustn't be too hard on Paley. But he is, I think, very, very optimistic at certain points. For example, if God designed and constructed the biological realm, why is there pain? I mean, you all ask that question. Let me give you Paley's answer. Paley answers this question by referring to toothache. And he says, look, we all have toothache from time to time, it's not much fun. Did God design toothache? No, he didn't. We just have toothache, and that's rather irritating, but actually teeth serve a very, very good function. The pain is a byproduct. It's not what God intended, it's what's happened. So God did not design toothache to annoy us. It's just something that arises through a system as a sort of epiphenomenon. Now, I personally find that very persuasive, but it's a good example. And Paley, I think, is very, very lyrical in his praise of the beauty of nature, but doesn't actually really engage some of the questions. So let me just tell you one of the questions that Paley doesn't engage, and that is nature as a food chain. Tennyson's very famous line in Memoriam, nature is red and tooth and claw. I'm sure Paley knew about that, but he doesn't talk about this. He talks about lambs gallivanting around fields happily. It's a wonderful world. And you just don't ask the question, why are the lambs in that field? What's going to happen to them? You just don't think about that. And John Ruskin, who some of you will have heard of, wrote a very famous critique of Paley, which said, look, imagine a beautiful scene, the beautiful mountains, lovely scenery, and then the sort of animals eating each other, their dead bodies, there are starving people. And the point he's trying to make is actually nature is complex, it's ambivalent. It's morally and aesthetically ambivalent. I think the difficulty I would have with Paley is he's not very good at coping with this complexity of nature. And so this, I think, really is the kind of issue that I'm going to be trying to talk about a little bit in this session this morning. I'm going to ask, what do we do with this? What do we do with the complexity of nature? What lines of thought might we open up? And I summarise that using this phrase, the aesthetic and moral ambiguity of nature. What I mean by that is, look, when you look at nature, look out there. I mean, that's nice. If you look at, for example, hyenas eating antelope, something like that, it wouldn't be quite nice. But it's all part of nature. And the issue is, how do we deal with this? How do we develop vocabulary that can cope with this? People talk about natural evil, for example. I would have difficulty with that because, for me, a hyena eating something to survive isn't evil. It's just natural. We might say that's natural and we think it's evil. But the question is, were we bringing that judgment to say that's evil? It's a very interesting question, which I'm sure you've all thought about. And we might also, I think, just ask, natural theology. I mean, I've talked in natural theology in terms that has emphasized the sense-making aspects of it. In other words, truth. What about beauty? I mean, the so-called Platonic triad, truth, beauty, goodness. And I think that there's a lot to be said focusing on this idea of beauty. What's the point of something being beautiful? I mean, it's a very interesting point. Because certainly as a biologist, I'm not absolutely sure I can give you a good account of why something needs to be beautiful, but it is. And it sort of way adds something to us. Why? And of course the idea of goodness as well, but which I haven't really got time to talk about. Paley's approach, of course, runs into the difficulty with Darwin. This is something we've talked about in this conference already. In one sentence, Darwin's theory suggests that what Paley attributes to a conscious designer might have happened by a process which simply led to that. Although Darwin actually was very careful to leave open the question about how that process came into being. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. Charles Kingsley is a very interesting writer. You probably have read his Water Babes, but he also gave a very interesting lecture called The Natural Theology of the Future, in which he reflects on Darwinism. And he's saying, look, what Darwin has done actually is simply clarify how God creates. And Kingsley's argument goes like this, and it's an argument I think many of you will recognize. We used to think God made things like that. Well, that's good. But actually, it's even better. God made the world so it can have autonomy, it can create itself under God's providential guidance. Isn't that even better? And so this actually became almost like the official creed of the Church of England. You probably have read Frederick Temple. Frederick Temple became Archbishop of Canterbury in I think it was 1902 or something. And he wrote a very famous paper on this, in which he just repeats what Paley says. Look, this is what Darwin has just clarified, an aspect of Christian doctrine of creation, that in fact God creates a world which has the capacity to develop under God's providential guidance. And actually it's an interesting line of argument. But really, it's this I want to talk about this morning, because I think this is where most of us hit issues. When we look at the biological world, sure, there are bits that are beautiful, but there are also bits that are ugly, nasty, that actually make us feel deeply uneasy. And I want to ask, where do we go with this? We talk about the beauty of nature, and that's really, really nice. What about its less pleasant aspects? So what about ugliness in nature? I mean, I talk a lot about the beauty of nature, but it's all very well to talk about beautiful scenery, but very often we see things in nature that strike us being repellent, as being ugly. And Holmes Roulston, a very well-known environmental ethicist, in effect asks us to imagine that we are walking through the countryside, having a lovely hike, and suddenly in the midst of a flower-strewn meadow, we find our paths are blocked by the rotting carcass of an elk full of maggots. And the point he's going to make is we're going to say yuck, and sort of way feel our walk in the countryside has been ruined because of this. His point is, look, it's all part of nature. You've got to get used to that. But intellectually, he says we've got to get used to the fact that actually this raises a problem for us. We don't like this. It seems to us to say nature is inconsistent or incoherent. And so in his book, Environmental Ethics, Roulston tries to wrestle with this and take it somewhere. And one of the questions he asks is this: why do we feel that way? Because actually, if I put it like this, this is an intuitive judgment. You're not looking at this and reasoning about it. You're saying, yuck, it's not nice. Where does that feeling come from? And Roulston makes some very good points, which I'm going to explore with you. Roulston suggests that actually our instinctively negative approach to some aspects of nature, like rotting carcasses, is what Roulston calls an evolutionary predisposition. Let me unpack what I think he means. I think what he means is that actually there's certain inbuilt mechanisms within us which make us avoid certain things that might damage us, like rotting carcasses. These may be great for flies who are attracted to them. So flies, if they do natural theology, would say great. Although I have to say there's no evidence they do. But if they did, they'd say lovely. Let's go there. But for us, we say yuck because we see this as a threat to health. Not something we've consciously thought through, but simply something instinctive within us which says you stay clear of that. And his point is, if this is right, we're allowing these predispositions to determine our attitude towards nature. And he says, look, we must instead have a more considered and reflective response to the complexity of nature. Now, I think this is interesting. So what I'm going to do, if I may, is tell you the two things he says about this and ask you what you make of them. I think personally they are quite interesting. So let's take the first of these. You've got to set this in context, he says. And decaying animal or plant may seem repulsive in the context of unreflective experience. What he means by that is, you see this and you go, ugh. But he says, look, don't do that. Think about it. He says, look, set it in the holistic context of an ecosystemic perspective. Every event, he writes, is framed by its environment, and this frame becomes part of the bigger picture we have to appreciate. So what he's saying is, look, just overcome your instincts and ask, what is that dead animal doing? Well, the answer is it's fertilizing the ground. The point he makes is, look, at the rotting hulk of a tree or a dead elk may look repulsive, but in the case of the tree, it provides nesting cavities, perches, insect larvae, food for birds, nutrients for the soil, and so on. Similarly, the rotting carcass of an elk provides nutrients for the soil. Listen to this, in which beautiful flowers will grow. He's saying, look, step back, see the bigger picture. This has got to happen. And actually, it may be an unpleasant part of the process, but the outcomes are good. And if this didn't happen, we wouldn't have life. I mean, that's really the bottom line of his argument. So he doesn't resolve the issue. I'll make that absolutely clear. I think for most people who say, well, this sets this in a good context, but it doesn't resolve the issue. But nevertheless, it's important to have that intuition challenged. So that's the second point he makes, an ongoing narrative. Now, this is quite a good point again. Think of a film, okay? And what Rolston is saying is, look, there's this film, and what we are doing is freezing a single frame and seeing just that. We don't ask what happened before, we don't ask what happens afterwards, but to make sense of the frame, we need to make sense of the ongoing narrative. Rolston suggests that we tend to freeze a single frame of an ongoing narrative, fail to realize this moment, he calls it, leads on to something beautiful. Now look at this phrase. Momentary ugliness is only a still shot in an ongoing motion picture. Now, again, it doesn't solve anything, but actually it just does give you a different way of looking at it, which means you see it in a slightly different way. Freezing the narrative at this moment, for example, of rotting elk, emphasizes the ugliness, but it fails to see what lies further on in the narrative. In that, death and decay unleash transformative forces that leads towards beauty over time. So here's his quote. I mean, it's not quite as well written as C.S. Lewis, but it is actually quite a good quote. Ugliness, though present at times, I think what he means momentarily, in particulars, is not the last world. So in other words, he's saying, look, what we deem to be ugly actually leads on to beauty. Now again, it doesn't solve anything, but it does help you realize things are a bit more complicated than you first think. So if I had to summarize Rolston, I mean, here are the points I would make for you to go away and think about. Number one, we have certain intuitions which are there partly to help us to survive. In other words, we avoid things that could be health risks, like rotting carcasses. We just see these being repulsive. It doesn't mean they are. It means that we feel that way. And Rolston's just saying, look, challenge that. Try and A, see the context, and B, see the bigger narrative. And actually, it means you see things in a slightly different way. So, let's move on now and look at some more complex questions relating to natural theology. And of course, one of the reasons that Richard Dawkins is so critical of William Paley is that Paley has a very strongly teleological reading of nature. What does that word mean? It means, in effect, that everything is there for a purpose, that it's been intentionally placed there for a reason. And Paley's argument is that, by looking at the structures of nature, above all the biological structures of nature, in effect, it allows you to see what role it plays, and of course, it was designed for that purpose. So Paley's argument is something like this. God placed that biological feature there in order to achieve this purpose. Darwin's approach, and here I have to say I do paraphrase Darwin quite considerably, but Darwin's approach would be much more, look, there was a need for something like this, or there was a gap for something like this, and therefore something came along, and when it survived, it filled that gap. In other words, it kind of, its existence was mandated by that, or it adapted to that gap, or something like that. In other words, it's not designed to fill, but filled and hence seemed designed. So what we need to look at is where this takes us. New atheist writers, Richard Dawkins is a very good example, although Richard Dawkins is not well at the moment. He had a stroke, so I'm sure we're thinking of him. Peter Atkins, who taught me physical chemistry many, many years ago, it's very, very clear that there is no purpose or design in nature at all. And this quote, I think, gives us a good example of what he's saying. We are children of chaos, the deep structure of change is decay. Gone is all purpose, all that's left is direction. This is the bleakness we have to accept as we peer deeply and dispassionately to the heart of the universe. So in other words, he's saying, look, what you see around you, what you are, is just, random. Chaos, that's just the way it is. And I know you've had quite a lot of input on this already, so I'm not going to develop this in any detail, but the key point is that Atkins and many others are saying is, what you see is the result of chaos. It's not planned. The deeper questions that I know you'll have looked at are, is chaos actually the foundation of order? And it's a very interesting question, and it's something that actually Atkins and Dawkins don't really talk about at all. It's one of those things where what seems like chaos is actually the means of emergence of order. But it's one of those things that keeps coming back, keeps recurring in these debates about natural theology. Again, here's Richard Dawkins. Quote from his book, River Out of Eden. I've mentioned this before, but it summarized, I think, exactly what we're looking at. The universe we observe is precisely what we expect. If there's no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind prejudice and indifference. In responding to this, I think there are a number of points we might make. One of them is with this. Look, this is in effect a theory-driven reading of nature. In effect, that point I made earlier, that in effect we tend to approach nature through a theoretical lens, that in effect a theoretical lens accentuates our attentiveness towards some things, but also makes us blind to other things. That's what's so worrying about a theory. A theory very often says there is nothing to see, so don't even bother looking. For example, classic example of this is William Herschel's discovery of the planet Uranus in 1783. He saw this new planet. When they tracked back to the star charts of the 1600s, there was Uranus on the star maps. It's just people weren't expecting a planet beyond Saturn, so they didn't look for it. And Herschel actually, it wasn't Herschel discovered Uranus, he discovered that Uranus was a planet, which is a very different idea. And what Dawkins is saying is, well, there's nothing to see, that's it. The universe we observe, in other words, I don't see these things. The question is there another theoretical frame, there's another lens that allows you to see these things? So one of the points I'm trying to make here is that it's actually quite a complex issue. This Francisco Ayala, a well-known biologist, I'm sure you probably had him mentioned this weekend already, his point is simply, look, you cannot do biology without teleology. You may not like the word, if you're a secular biologist, but you've got to realize there is directionality, there's intentionality within the biological domain. Its systems are directly organized. Teleological systems are appropriate in biology, and they make no sense when used in the physical sciences, that's right. But when you get to the biological level, things change. Again, if I had time, I talk about theories of emergence, whereby certain things are not present in lower levels, emerge at higher levels, and purpose unquestionably emerges at the biological level. So there's something going on there, and what I'm saying to you really is, look, I'm sure Dawkins makes some very good points, but it's not adequate. We need a bigger theory, a better theory, and there are several that we can give. I'll again has been very cautious here, but he's simply saying that, look, you cannot account for the complexity of biological systems without invoking some sort of teleology. The issue is, what do you mean by that word teleology? Do you mean an externally imposed directionality, or in effect an internally generated directionality? But actually, whichever answer you give, the correlation between them becomes very, very interesting. And if I have time, and I'm just watching the clock, and perhaps I do not at that time, Ernst Mayer's, well, you might have noticed Ernst Mayr died a very old man, which is good news for all of you studying biology, I think. He basically says, look, you know, that all the theories of teleology said, look, either there's a kind of God imposing directionality, or there's some mysterious force within nature. Think of vitalism, or Henri Bergson's Elan Vital, something like that, you know. But basically saying, look, whatever the explanation is, this is there. And we've got to learn to live with that. Now, I'm just going to flick through this very, very quickly because I want to look at this. Dawkins himself, interestingly, although he's very critical of the idea of teleology, actually ends up implicitly assuming some such teleology. For example, the whole language of the selfish gene is very, very interesting. And interestingly, I don't know if any of you have seen the 30th anniversary edition of Selfish Gene, you know, where in fact Dawkins is musing as to whether that title was good. Maybe the cooperative gene might actually have been better. But it's really interesting because he begins to bring back in the idea of teleology. Nature's going somewhere. And again, it's really very, very significant. So let's talk about Stephen Jay Gould. Gould basically accentuates the importance of contingency. Everything happens by accident. Again, if you want to use the word chaos, that's fine. And the assumption is chaos, contingency, in effect, are inimical to, are perhaps inconsistent with order. But actually, particularly those who are physicists would say, no, actually, chaos is the womb of order. That's how order happens. And chaotic processes, paradoxically, lead to order. And this is something that a number of people develop. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould said, look, if we were to replay the videotape, it's a very 1990s analogy, isn't it, of life. In effect, the same thing wouldn't happen every time. But you've heard this man. Now, I say to you, this is an old photo, Simon. So hasn't changed. Oh, well, there we are. Well, anyway. That's Simon. That's still Simon. You've heard him speak on this, so all I need to do is just sketch the points he makes in Life Solution. You've all read this. Basically, what he's saying is, look, maybe there is a random search engine, but if there are things there to be discovered, they're going to be found. And the issue is finding those things. And he uses a number of ideas. The idea of convergent evolution, but it's really this point here, the recurrent tendency of biological organisms to arrive at the same solution to a particular need. And he uses phrases like islands of stability. So what he's trying to say is this, look, supposing there are certain, you've got a big chessboard, okay? Imagine a chessboard, and there's 64 squares, and one or two of them are viable, and the other 63 or 64 aren't. If you have a random search engine, you're going to end up on those viable squares at some point. That's the key point. Now, Simon is a genius for good illustrations, and he uses a very nice one, which I'm going to come to in a minute. You probably want it already, but this is the point. The evolutionary routes are many, but the destinations are limited. In other words, you're going to end up at certain islands of stability, certain fixed points, because the process may zigzag, but actually, if there are certain outcomes that are stable, you're going to get to them. And so it's really saying that there may be chaos in the process of finding, but there are things waiting to be found, and sooner or later they will be found. And, he gives lots of examples of these, photosynthesis in the eye. But the example, which I think most of you will just remember, because it's a very nice visual image, is of course Easter Island, which is in the middle of nowhere. Those of you who live in the Pacific, I'm not implying that the Pacific is nowhere, I'm just saying it's vast, and there is this tiny little line in the middle of it, which was found. Now the question is, why? Well, the answer is it was. People just were out, they were looking for something, they found it eventually. And what Simon is really saying is, look, that is one way of thinking about evolution. It's all about trying to tell a story which respects chaos, contingency, but absolutely refuses to say that is inimical to order and stability. These are all part of a complicated picture which really needs to be unfolded. So there's his strapline. Isolated islands provide havens of biological possibility and an ocean of maladaptiveness. Now this doesn't solve some of the problems we've been looking at, but I want to suggest to you it gives you a different context in which to see them. Now, I've got to wrap up in a moment, so let me see what I was going to say. Yes, I'm going to wrap up with John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman, interesting writer, inaccessible at many points, but nevertheless, every now and then, there are just flashes of genius. And I think this is one of them. I'll read it to you and then comment. I believe in design because I believe in God, not in God because I see design. I think that's good. Here's my question to you. How could you see design in nature? I think you can. What I think you would say is, I see something, and as I reflect on that something, I infer it was designed. You see what I'm saying? Design is something you see, it's something you infer. I mean, supposing you are interested in Neanderthals, okay, and you look at Neanderthal burial sites and you pick up a piece of rock, and actually it looks slightly different from the others around, and the question is this a rock or is it a tool? How would I tell the difference? And you have to infer from its structure that actually this has been crafted in some way. What Newman is saying is that you don't see design, but if you're a Christian, you take this theoretical perspective. The Greek word theoria, which we get a word theory, literally means a way of beholding, okay, a way of beholding. If you look at nature in this way, it allows you to see nature in this way. The key question is this. This is a point that actually you find in the writings of G.K. Chesterton. And it's a very nice idea. For Chesterton, you look at the world and it's a bit ambivalent. The issue is it overall beautiful with patches of ugliness, or is it ugly with the occasional patch of beauty? It's a question of where the emphasis lies. And what I'm trying to say to you is that natural theology, meaning there's some kind of connection between the world we see and nature and God, actually allows you to accentuate the positives and recognize the negatives have to be there if the positives are to be there. And that's a hard thing to grasp, but nevertheless, it's very interesting. And on that point, I'm going to end, not because we've solved any of these problems, but as you can see, we've run out of time. But this gives me the wonderful opportunity of actually letting you direct the conversation for the next half hour. Let me say that I'm very happy to talk about anything I've raised in this lecture, but I wasn't here last night. And so from the discussion you had last night, if you want to ask me any of those questions, I'm more than happy to do this in the time I have with you. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and we'll move into a time of Q&A.
So, okay, I can see questions, hands going up. Let's start here. Caroline?
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I've actually got two questions, very, very quickly. The first one is, can we not account for the ugliness, so-called, of nature, because nature and man, both each in their own ways, are fallen?
Right, and the answer is that there's a standard way of doing it. In other words, the issue is, in a very naive way of doing natural theology, we have a flawless humanity looking at a flawless nature. In reality, we're messed up. We get things wrong all the time. I mean, look at the psychology of human attention. We misread things. Very often for cultural reasons, but sometimes simply for personal reasons. And actually, very often we see what we want to see. And so the issue, that's why I critique Richard Dawkins, because he's decided whether there isn't anything to see, so he doesn't see it. So I think you have to say that, in effect, if you take, for example, a classical position which we find in Calvin, which is that, in effect, a fallen human mind is looking at a fallen nature, then, in effect, you are going to end up with a very seriously mixed up views of God. And Calvin's argument is, look, we realize there's something there, but actually, that's not reliable in terms of what that is or its characteristics. So we then begin to say, well, how does this relate to what we find in the Christian Bible? It clarifies it, it extends it. So for Calvin, reading Scripture clarifies and expands the very limited amount you can know about God from nature. And Calvin's big concern is you in effect end up in idolatry, you worship nature, because you think that's it, but no, it's not. Thank you.
May I ask a second? The ancients, the early Christians, clearly distinguished between two sorts of knowledge, cataphatic and apophatic. The cataphatic was all that you could find through your own senses of the world about you, and that's wholly good. But you get to the point when you must suppress all that knowledge to move to the apophatic awareness of God, which is the word you used, theory. So in that sense, you cannot come to an appreciation of God through the physical senses. And in fact, you do have to suppress them.
Yes, you do. Well, let me answer that because it's a very good question. We'll look at Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, because these are two writers who really accentuate that. What they say is, look, you look at the natural world and it points you in certain directions, but it cannot conceivably disclose the fullness of God. And if you think it does, you're making a very, very serious mistake. In fact, they go further than that and say you actually, because we are human, because we are creatures, because we are sinners, we cannot behold God in all his fullness. And therefore, if we think we've got God pinned down, we are simply deluding ourselves. So really the issue is how do you balance the positive, meaning we can say this, and the negative, meaning we can't be over-stickler, we can't overthink God, if I can put it like that. And they find their own way of doing it. And I think you and I probably have to do the same ourselves. Actually, we rejoice in what we do know, but we recognise what we don't know. And the danger is that we transgress too much in one way or the other. So it's a good question. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Ray, and then next here. And then you have a question. Oh, it's been answered. We'll go back then.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's very much appreciated. My question is about the illustration that you used about the elk. And I have to say, at the moment, my problem is not so much in the animal kingdom, but rather in the relationship of the human kingdom to the animal kingdom. So, just to take your story and represent it, if I was walking in the countryside and came across not the rotting carcass of an elk, but the rotting carcass of a human that had been consumed by a virus and hadn't been subjected to a natural accident, such as an earthquake, or being attacked by another human, but had been killed by something from the animal world entering into them. Do you have a lens through which a human on his countryside walk could view that tragedy to enable him perhaps to understand it more rather than seeing it as just arbitrariness in creation? Now, I've heard two answers from sort of Christian theology or Christian ministers. One is the one we've already heard, we're all fallen, so this is what happens. Another answer I've heard in this conference, which doesn't convince me, is that we all have to die sooner or later. It's rather sad that this human died sooner rather than later, but that could happen to any one of us. The other answer I've heard is, well, Jesus Christ suffered and he died. But the problem for me is he didn't die as a result of something from the animal kingdom entering into him. He died because he was murdered by other evil human beings. So I don't really have a problem with that in the purpose of salvation. My problem area is the interface between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, well, it's reasonably clear. I think the issue is whether I can give a clear answer. It's rather a bigger challenge. I mean, the point you make is very, very good. And I think that if you go back to classical Roman law, I mean, that they didn't understand about diseases and things like that. So, I mean, in classic Roman law, for example, supposing I were to be lying under a pear tree and the pear drops and chokes me, actually they chopped the pear tree down because it was responsible for killing me, you see. And there's this issue of agency that's involved here, and they didn't really understand it, didn't know about viruses or anything like that. So we're in a different situation now. But what I would say is this. I think we have to be careful about overthinking this. Actually, there's a danger that we become all logical about this. And I think one of the things I want to say is that this whole thing reminds us of the vulnerability of human beings. We're fragile. We're within a system. And what we try and do is we try and protect ourselves against this. We try and, in effect, immunize ourselves. So in effect, we place distance between ourselves and nature. That happens in nature. We can stop this happening. And if you read Ernst Becker's very famous book, which won the Pulitzer Prize, The Denial of Death, which I'm sure either you've read or come across, he's just saying we can't cope with the thought of death. And so A, we try to postpone as long as possible, and B, we try to just not think about it very much. But for me, part of a natural theology is we are part of the natural world. We are different, absolutely agreed, But we've got to recognise that actually this means that we are subject to the same forces that affect plants and animals. The danger is that actually we ignore the fact that very often we are the people who are able to change our environments in ways that, you know, donkeys and cows and these nice flowers out here can't. And so if you say that one thing distinctive about human beings is the ability to change their environments, then very often we do these for reasons that are very, very questionable. And as a result, we end up destroying things. Things that we develop, which have the capacity to heal, can also be used to kill as well. So actually, all of this accentuates the fact that actually, although we are part of the natural world, hence subject to all these vulnerabilities, all these things I've been talking about, we do have the capacity to try and change it. But very often we do that, we end up actually making things worse than making things better. This doesn't answer your question. I want to make that absolutely clear. But it just reminds us that very often we present ourselves somehow standing above nature, thinking about it, whereas actually we're part of it. And one of the things that Darwin accentuates is the fact that there's a close connection between humanity and the animal kingdom than we think. And I think that it reminds us we're part of a vulnerable natural order. And that, I think, is important, thinking about who we are, what's going to happen to us. In terms of natural theology, I think it does raise this very interesting question about not so much how we theologically account for suffering, using, for example, suffering of Christ on the cross, though I want to say that's actually a very important way of approaching it. But it's much more, what is the place of death and suffering in nature? And although I was a little bit critical of Holmes Rolston, actually, you know, he's thinking that one through. And he's saying, look, we've just got to bite this bullet. No suffering, no death, no growth. And it's very thought. I mean, sometimes people say to me, look, wouldn't it be wonderful if we didn't suffer? I mean, William Paley, for example, we didn't have toothache. But I mean, is it anesthesia? Is that what the neurological disease, we don't feel pain? I mean, there are people who have this, and they don't live very long. And the reason they don't live very long is that you know, pain stops you, it allows you to be alert to threats. And if you can't feel pain, your hand might be burning through coming constantly hot, and you don't realise it. So actually, there is this sense that although I appreciate pain can go terribly wrong, think of various forms of cancer, actually, we really do need it. I think it's just biting the bullet and saying, look, for some reason we don't understand, this is the way things are. And we may not fully understand that, but we've got to live within the real world rather than trying to construct an imaginary alternative. So I live with unresolved questions on this. But actually, as I get older, I sort of begin to realise that you can live with some unresolved questions, because very often the answers people give are just so slick and simple that they're actually unsatisfactory. But it's not a very good answer, but it's mapping on what I think.
Okay, one question here.
If I could return to this polarity that I think you offered to us, that if one looks at nature with the lens of a believer, one sees the hand and purpose of God. If you use the lens of the skeptic, of the non-believer, you don't see the hand of God. So that's very clear, and I understand the logic behind that. But my question is, where does this leave us in terms of the importance of maintaining dialogue between Christians and a skeptical society?
Yes, I think it's very good.
I ask this question because it's something that I am increasingly involved in.
Good. Well, I'm very glad you're involved in that. It's a very good question. I think that if what I'm saying is right, namely that there are a family of Christian ways of looking at nature, there are a family of secular ways of looking at nature, then actually it's really quite difficult for these to talk to each other. That's the point you're making. It's a very good point. And so if what I'm saying is right, then the kind of approach to apologetics that follows from that is the kind of approach that C.S. Lewis uses. And if you look at, for example, Mere Christianity, I'm thinking particularly of the chapter on hope, okay? What Lewis does is in effect saying, look, from your perspective, you see it this way, it looks like this. Now, humour me, step into my way of seeing things. Just try and make that imaginative leap. You're now looking at the world from this perspective. I want you to try and imagine what you'll see. Try and see it my way. And if you see it from this perspective, it looks like this. Do you see that? And actually, does not make a lot of sense. Do you see that? In effect, it's not saying, here are 65 very good reasons for thinking I'm right. It's much more an imaginative beholding of nature. And he's saying, look, step into my way of thinking, look at it that way. What do you think? And actually, that is the way an awful lot of scientists think. It's the way I thought as a scientist. And when you're checking out a theory, what you tend to do is say, right, let me step into this theoretical way of looking at things. Now, what do I see? How well does it map onto what I actually observe? Now, okay, it's quite good. Let's try this one. Step into this way of seeing things. I look and it's better. And I can see it's better. So I say, that's the one I'm working with. So in effect, that's really what we're saying. There may be common ground. I think that's right. But I think it's much more important to realize that one of the fundamental themes in apologetics is try seeing it this way. Try seeing it this way. I understand how you see it. Let me try and explain to you how I see it and let you step into that. What do you make of that? It's about imagination, not an anti-rational imagination, but a reason-informed imagination, but nevertheless one that's saying, try seeing this in a new way. Thank you.
Alexander, and then we'll go back to Diana.
I would like to approach the argument by Rolston from the analogy perspective. So in which way would the ethics of the elk carcass rotting be an analogy of the gospel ethics, actually, where death rather is something that has to be overcome, and it's not really a means of growing. I think there is the grain parable, of course, but I think that's a different kind of dying if the grain falls into the ground. So I see a problem there. On the other hand, what I find intriguing is this ethics of Rawlston, or the implied ethics, opens a whole new perspective on the climate change. Usually people warn against the climate change, but I think we can view it as something. We create a new environment that opens up a whole new range of possibilities, like ananas in Norway and so on, which really, we shouldn't be afraid of the climate change, and why should we do anything about that? Just to provoke you a bit with that.
Right, well, I'm sure the Norwegians will be delighted to have greater biological diversity. I think what Rolston's really saying is, look, there are dead animals in the world, get used to it. Try and see that in a different way. I think he's in effect trying to challenge certain intuitive ways of thinking and just saying maybe our natural theology depends rather too much on certain intuitions which we have allowed to become normative in terms of aesthetic and moral judgment. So I think that's an interesting point. I don't think that the dead elk helps us at all with the question of resurrection. I think that is, you're right. I mean, there's no connection between them at all. I mean, what we could construct one, but I mean, there's no obvious immediate connection. What I think we're saying really is that in the world as we know it, death gives way to life. Your death enables somebody else to live. And actually, that's what Darwin is saying. I mean, if I could summarize Darwin dreadfully, this is a very bad summary of Darwin. But what Darwin is saying is that actually those who are not so well adapted have to die, so those who are better adapted can live. I mean, that was one of the key themes there. Actually, no death, no evolution, if I put it very, very simplistically. But that doesn't mean that that is all there is to say. Because, again, this seems to me to be very simplistic, but there's enough truth in it to make it worth thinking about. Isn't Christianity actually inverting a Darwinian ethic? Isn't it actually trying to say, look, it's those who are not so well adapted, those who are weak, who actually have a special place in God's purposes. Actually, if you like, it's about learning to protect those who actually might be a liability. You know, and there are a whole series of things there where you would say that Christianity in many ways is inverting this. And of course, one of the big debates in evolution biology, not so much in part of evolution biologists, but those who watch the debates and try and interpret them, is whether you can have a Darwinian ethic. And actually, I don't think you can. I know Julian Huxley thought you could, but if you look at that very famous lecture at Oxford in 1898 by Thomas Huxley, we're basically saying, look, we observe these processes in nature. We must on no account replicate these in our ethical thinking. That is something different. Ethics transcends nature. You know, he's really saying there has to be something above the natural process which gives us a standpoint by which we judge how we behave. In the case of the gospel and the whole idea of hope and resurrection and eternal life and so on, I mean, I am perfectly happy with dying. I hope it won't take too long, because I can see that brings benefits. It means there's space for one extra person on the planet, and I might be able to recycle myself in some helpful way. But that doesn't stop me believing in resurrection. It's something different. It's about the transformation of existence, about the continuation of my most important relationship with life, which is God. And actually, that is something that you can fit into the Christian way of looking at nature, which is very much to do with fulfillment of what it seems to be promised. For me, the really big theological issue is actually slightly different, and it's this. And it's raised by Charles Wesley in that very famous sermon, The Great Restoration. Here's his question: will there be animals in heaven? And his answer is yes, there will be, because for him, resurrection is about restoration. And he picks up on those passages from Isaiah, about wolves and lambs and all sorts of interesting things, and says actually, there's some sense in which we're talking about restored creation, where actually we are raised to a higher level, but also so are the animals. And again, it's a piece of theological speculation, but actually it's quite enjoyable theological speculation, as he just tries to think through how these things can be held together. Thank you.
DNA?
Thanks for your lecture. So going back to this issue of teleology, some theologians today are discussing about the return of a teleological way to see reality. I could see some of it in John Milbeck, for example, or in Hans Borsma from Regent College, I think. And much of it comes from Henri de Lubac and the idea that there is an aspiration in creation for grace and for transcendence. And some of them argue that we should take back a teleological view of reality. So I just want to know if you think it is possible or even interesting to connect this kind of theological mood to discussions on teleology from science and religion today.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, let's answer your question. Teleology, yes. Interesting, yes. Possible, yes. Science and religion, question mark. Because most theologians don't understand what teleology is in the scientific context and misunderstand it and end up producing some stuff that is really of questionable utility. There's a massive gap between a theologian and someone who's been working in a scientific culture. And very often that involves a misreading of what words mean. So what I would suggest is that when I read Milbank, I see his own notion of teleology. How I map that on to the fundamentally empirical notions of teleology I see in Ernst Mayr, for example, it seems to me to be quite a challenge, actually. So I think we just need to be aware that very often a word is open to multiple interpretations. I mean, for example, Wolfgang Pannenberg, I say with some regret, I don't think really understands science as well as he should. I mean, he misreads the word field, so I'm very, very cautious about this. But that does not negate the fact that there are some very interesting dialogues to be held here. I think for me it's really about helping theologians to actually get what, for example, an evolutionary biologist would mean by the word teleology, get its nuances, get its empirical groundings, and then ask, now I understand what that is, how can I map that on to a theological way of looking at nature? And that seems to me to actually have real potential. But I will tell you that in my experience, these things go wrong very, very early on because the theologians don't understand how scientists use these words. And until that gap is bridged, these discussions are just a waste of time. I'm sorry to be so negative, but I'm just telling you the way I see things. I mean, theologians overhear conversations and think they understand them. And it's dangerous, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Can you go that side, Sure. And then we'll come over to you.
Alister, thank you for an expansive and really stimulating lecture. I too want to go back to the Holmes-Rolston,
Yes.
which I know you think is interesting, but you don't think completely gets the job done. But what would you say to this? It seems to me that Holmes there is actually, with his example of a rotting elk, is conflating two different things. One is death, and the other one is contagion.
Yes.
So, you know, if you walk through a forest and you see a big pile of vomit, you're going to feel repugnance as well. But set aside the contagion. And here's another thought experiment. You're walking through a forest and you see a group of primates. And one of the alpha male is picking up by the hind legs many of the infants and bashing their heads against rocks. There's not a sense of repugnance there as much as just plain horror. And does Holmes's thought experiment work with that? I know you don't like the term natural evil, but maybe some people use the term non-moral evil. How do you deal with that in the context of Holmes's thoughts?
Well, I suppose what I would have to say is that it brings home to me how some of the conversations we have with primatologists kind of terminate prematurely, because very often primatologists want to accentuate the continuity between human beings and primates, which of course I accept and respect. But there are points at which there are fundamental issues where we might say that perhaps this indicates where we've come from, but not where we want to be. And you've given a very, very lucid example. I mean, well, there's nobody here from ancient Sparta, so I can say this without offending anybody, but they did the same thing. I mean, the reason they did this was in effect that they wanted to ensure that they would be fit for beating up Athens. So they would put their children out on rocks, and the ones that survived, great. The ones that didn't, well, so. It was in effect a way of, almost a way of selecting for certain functions. And you can see how that, to me, that's outrageous. But if you were to challenge me and say, well, why do you find that outrageous? Is it simply intuition, or is there some deep-seated moral framework that says that? I need to pause and think about that. I think actually that's one of the areas where my Christian judgment and something intuitive within me resonate a little bit. But I think you're right about Holmes, Ralston. I think the analogy he gives is primarily about contagion and secondarily about death. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. It's not so much that it's dead, it's rotting. That's the thing that's really there. But I'm allowing on that because, even though I've never actually seen a dead elk, because I live in the wrong part of the world, I can get the analogy, and it raises questions for me. I think that it does work quite well there. But you're right, and I think that for me, if I can put it like this, when we're looking at dead elks or chimpanzees behaving in certain ways, I mean, I think one of the things that we sometimes realise is that these raise very good questions, but don't necessarily answer them. And for me, that's why I'm still a bit cautious about this, because I'm still thinking some of these things through, and I'm not sure I've actually got to us an end point, although I'm very happy with some of the options I'm exploring. But these sort of things are very, very good at challenging me and saying, look, how does that fit in? Does it fit in at all? And I think one of the things, again, as I was saying, the psychologists tell us that you become wiser as you get older, which I do hope it's right. but there is a sense in which actually when you're younger, you do want all the loose ends tied up. And as you get older, partly because you know more, and partly because you've seen the efforts people make to do this, you begin to realise it's very difficult to tie up all the loose ends, and you're living with theoretical perspective, which is fuzzy. Very often fuzzy at the edges, sometimes fuzzy at the business as well. And actually, I've got used to doing that. And your very good question just says, go away and think about that a bit more, which I'm very happy to do. Well, I'd love to hear your answer to that very good question from the back, but we haven't time for that. I think that's a very good question.
Okay, this is the last, a quick question from Robert there.
I'm not sure this is a quick question, but thinking about engaging with young people who very often have a natural aversion to the existence of God, how do we move from natural theology, which is a rational process, to supernatural theology, which they often see as not being a rational process? I'm sorry, that's not a very quick question.
No, it's a good question, though. I do a lot of talking in schools. I greatly enjoy it. And one thing I've noticed is that Richard Dawkins' great supporters are 16-year-old males. Because that's the way the world looks. And actually, when I was 16-year-old, that's how I thought too, which is obvious. You know. And in a certain sense in which it plays to a number of fundamental cultural instincts. You know, we all want to be rational. We all like to be part of an in-group, and it always helps us an out-group and look down on. And also, of course, this deep cultural intuition that science is progressive, religion is retrogressive. And a whole series of things like that. And actually, they are very hard to overcome by argumentation. And that's a very important point to make. And I meant to C.S. Lewis earlier, and I think actually he does something good to say here. And what Lewis is saying is, look, if our culture is in his essay, The Weight of Glory, 1941, I think it is, he talks about our culture being spellbound by a series of materialist and secularist beliefs, like, for example, what you see is what you get. There's nothing beyond the empirical. And he says the only way you can break a spell is by casting a better spell. And he has this wonderful passage. He talks about the need for us to present the Christian faith in imaginatively powerful ways. So in effect, the imagination becomes the gateway to the reason. So in effect, you say, my goodness, it's so attractive, I wonder if it's right. And in asking that question, you begin to do rational apologetics. You can't do rational apologetics. You've got to, in effect, capture the imagination and think, I wish this were true. And Lewis tries to do that. One of the things I would say, though, is that time and time again, I come across males who were 16 and are now 24. And actually, they've moved on in a big way. God, I was naive. No, that sort of thing. It's like that. And actually, there is a certain sense in which the world looks very certain and simple to a 16-year-old. And it's very hard to actually present a more complicated view of things. There comes a time when you're more receptive to a complicated view of things, and you realize that simple often means simplistic. But I think you've got to wait for people who are ready for that moment. That's my view, I'm afraid. But there is hope, I think. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for some wonderful questions. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you so much.